The old German shepherd suddenly stopped in the grocery store doorway and let out a low growl. Not angry, not scared, focused. His eyes locked onto an elderly man standing at the checkout counter with shaking hands. The old man carefully placed several military medals beside a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a pack of eggs. His voice barely came out. Will these cover it?" The young cashier froze. Her scanner hung uselessly in her hand as she stared at the medals spread across the counter like pieces of a broken life. "Sir, I don't think I can take those. Did this story touch your heart? Give it a thumbs up, share it around, and drop your location in the comments." The Marine holding the German Shepherd's leash slowed to a stop near the entrance. The dog refused to move forward. His ears stayed alert. His body became stiff. Then the K9 stared directly at one silver medal near the old man's trembling fingers. The Marine frowned. "Rex, what is it?" The dog gave a soft whine and pulled gently toward the checkout lane. People nearby noticed the scene but quickly looked away again. Some pretended to check their phones. Others pushed their carts faster. No one wanted to face the shame standing under those bright store lights. The old man lowered his head. Deep wrinkles covered his tired face. A faded Navy SEAL cap rested above watery eyes that looked exhausted from years of silent battles. "I'm not asking for pity," he whispered. "I just need enough food for the week." The cashier's eyes filled with tears. The German shepherd suddenly stepped closer and sniffed near the medals. His tail stopped moving completely. Something about that silver piece seemed to hold him there. The Marine tightened his grip on the leash, confused now. This dog had served beside him for 4 years. Explosives, missing people, hidden weapons. The K9 never reacted without reason. But this felt different. The dog looked back at the old veteran, then back at the medal again, like he recognized it. The Marine stepped closer to the checkout lane, his boots quiet against the floor tiles. The German shepherd moved beside him slowly, never taking his eyes off the old man's shaking hands. The cashier swallowed hard. "Sir, maybe there's another way." The old veteran gave a weak smile that carried more pain than comfort. "There usually isn't at my age." The dog suddenly let out another soft whine and sat directly beside the old man's leg. Not aggressive, protective. The veteran looked down in surprise. "Well, hey there." His rough fingers slowly moved toward the dog's head. The Marine watched carefully, ready to pull the leash if needed. But the German shepherd stayed completely calm as the old man touched behind his ears. Then something strange happened. The old man froze. His hand stayed resting on the dog's fur while his watery eyes narrowed slightly, like an old memory had just opened somewhere deep inside him. "You trained military?" he quietly asked the Marine. The question caught him off guard. "Yes, sir. Former K9 operations overseas." The old man nodded slowly. "I figured." The dog leaned harder against the veteran's leg, refusing to leave his side now. The Marine noticed the old man's breathing becoming uneven as he stared at the silver medal again. Up close, he could finally see scratches carved into the back of it. Tiny letters, almost worn away by time. The German shepherd pressed his nose directly against the medal and gave one sharp sniff. The old man's face suddenly lost color. How did he notice that? He whispered. The Marine looked confused. Notice what? For several seconds, the veteran said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the dog while fear and disbelief slowly mixed across his face. Then he carefully picked up the medal with trembling fingers. "That engraving," he murmured, "only one unit ever carried that mark." The dog's ears lifted instantly. And for the first time since entering the store, the old Navy SEAL looked truly afraid. The Marine glanced at the medal, then back at the old veteran. The fear in the man's eyes did not look confused. It looked personal. "What unit?" he asked quietly. The old man hesitated. His fingers tightened around the metal like he suddenly regretted pulling it out. Long time ago, he muttered. Buried history. The German Shepherd stood up again and moved closer, nose pressed near the veteran's coat pocket now. He sniffed carefully, then pawed once against the fabric. The Marine frowned. Rex never acts like this without reason. The cashier stepped back silently, giving them space. Even the people nearby had stopped pretending not to watch. The old veteran slowly reached into his coat pocket. His hand shook harder this time. Finally, he pulled out an old folded photograph with cracked edges. The picture looked faded from years of being carried around. The Marine leaned closer. A younger version of the old man stood beside a military working dog near a helicopter. Both looked covered in dirt and exhaustion. But the dog in the picture looked almost identical to Rex. Same sharp eyes. Same dark markings around the face. The old man stared at the photo silently. "He saved 6 men that night," he whispered. The German Shepherd gently nudged the photograph with his nose. The Marine felt chills move through his chest. "What was the dog's name?" For a second, the old veteran looked unable to answer. Then his voice cracked. "Ranger." The German Shepherd suddenly sat perfectly still at the sound of the name, not trained stillness, recognition. The Marine slowly looked down at his canine partner. Because Rex had never reacted to any word that way before. The grocery store felt strangely quiet now. Even the sound of shopping carts had faded into the background. The Marine stared at his dog in disbelief. Rex, the German Shepherd, ignored him completely. His eyes stayed locked on the old photograph in Walter's trembling hands. Walter swallowed hard and carefully traced one finger over the picture. "Ranger was the best K9 I ever saw," he whispered. "Fearless. Smart. Loyal till the very end." The dog beside him gave a soft whine. The Marine felt his heartbeat quicken. He had worked with military dogs for years. He understood instincts, memory, scent reactions. But this felt deeper than training. Walter slowly folded the photograph again, but the dog suddenly nudged his hand, stopping him. "You remember him somehow, don't you?" Walter murmured softly. The cashier wiped tears from her eyes behind the counter. The Marine crouched beside Rex. "Buddy, what is going on?" The German Shepherd suddenly turned and pulled toward Walter's coat again, this time harder. Walter looked nervous. Easy, easy. But the dog kept pushing his nose against the inside pocket like something important was hidden there. Finally, Walter sighed weakly and reached inside once more. A second dog tag slipped free and hit the counter with a small metallic sound. The Marine picked it up carefully. The moment he read the name, his face drained of color. Daniel Reed, his grandfather. For several long seconds, he could not breathe. Walter slowly looked away. "I kept it all these years," he whispered, "could never bring myself to mail it back." The Marine's hand shook around the tag. "My grandfather always talked about a Navy SEAL who saved his life during an operation overseas," he said quietly. "But he never knew the man's name." Walter closed his eyes. That mission cost good men. The German Shepherd moved closer to Walter again and rested his head gently against the old veteran's knee. Like he already knew the weight Walter had carried alone for decades. Walter's hands trembled as he stared down at the German Shepherd resting against him. For the first time since the Marine walked into the store, the old veteran no longer looked embarrassed. He looked tired, deeply tired. The Marine tightened his grip on the dog tag. His grandfather's name felt heavier than metal now. "He searched for you," he said quietly. "For years." Walter gave a small, painful laugh. Some men are easier left in the past. The cashier slowly pushed the groceries closer to Walter. "Sir, please take these." Walter shook his head immediately. "I can't." Before anyone could speak again, the German Shepherd suddenly stood up and pulled hard toward the store entrance. The Marine almost lost the leash. Rex. But the dog kept moving. Fast. Purposeful. He stopped near the old veteran's beat-up pickup truck parked outside under flickering lights, his nose pressed against the passenger door as he barked once. Walter froze. The Marine noticed it instantly. "What's in the truck?" Walter looked uneasy now. Nothing important. The German Shepherd barked again. Louder this time. Customers near the windows turned to watch. The Marine stepped closer to Walter carefully. "Sir, my dog thinks there's something you don't want us to see." Walter lowered his eyes. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then his shoulders slowly collapsed. "There's a box under the seat," he admitted quietly. The Marine opened the truck door while Rex jumped halfway inside, sniffing urgently. Beneath the dusty passenger seat sat a small weathered wooden box tied with faded rope. The moment Walter saw it being lifted out, pain crossed his face like an old wound reopening. "Those are letters," he whispered. The Marine carefully untied the rope. Inside were dozens of sealed envelopes, some yellow with age, some stained from rain. Every single one had military names written across the front. And resting on top of them all was another photograph of Walter beside the military dog named Ranger. But this time, Daniel Reed stood beside them too. The Marine picked up the photograph with shaking fingers. His grandfather looked young in the picture, smiling beside Walter and the military dog. Dirt covered their uniforms, but all three looked alive, like they had survived something impossible together. Rex stared closely at the photo, then gently sniffed the image of Ranger. Walter looked away toward the dark parking lot. "That was 2 days before the mission went bad," he said quietly. The cashier had followed them outside now, standing silently beside the truck. Even she could feel the weight sitting inside that small wooden box. The Marine carefully opened one of the envelopes. Walter stepped forward fast. "No." The Marine stopped immediately. Walter swallowed hard and rubbed his tired face. Those letters were meant for families. Men we lost. I wrote every one of them, but never mailed them. "Why not?" the Marine asked softly. Walter's eyes filled with shame. "Because I came home instead of them." Silence hit the parking lot. Rex slowly moved beside Walter again and leaned against his leg with quiet pressure, like he could sense the guilt crushing the old man from inside. Walter looked down at the dog and weakly scratched behind his ears. "Ranger used to do that too," he whispered. The Marine stared at him carefully now. "My grandfather said the SEAL who saved him disappeared after the mission," he said. "Nobody knew what happened." Walter gave a tired nod. "I stopped wanting to be found." The Marine looked back into the box. Most of the envelopes were old, unopened, protected carefully all these years. But one envelope looked newer than the others. Its edges were cleaner. Rex noticed it too. The German Shepherd suddenly pushed his nose against that single letter and let out a low whine. The Marine slowly picked it up. Written across the front were only 4 words. "To the Reed family." Walter's breathing became uneven the moment he saw it, because that letter had never been finished. The Marine held the unfinished letter carefully, like it might fall apart in his hands. Walter reached for it at first, then stopped himself. Rex stayed pressed against the old veteran's side, watching every movement. "You wrote this recently?" the Marine asked. Walter nodded once. 3 nights ago. His voice sounded weak now, exhausted. I figured maybe it was time somebody finally knew the truth. The Marine looked down at the envelope again. His grandfather's family name suddenly felt heavier than ever. What truth? Walter did not answer right away. A cold wind moved through the parking lot as cars rolled slowly past the store. The cashier quietly stepped back, sensing the moment did not belong to her anymore. Walter leaned against the truck for support. That mission wasn't supposed to happen, he finally said. Bad intel. Bad weather. Everything went wrong before we even landed. Rex listened closely, ears lifted. Walter's eyes stayed fixed somewhere far away now, trapped inside memories he had spent decades trying to bury. Ranger found the explosives first, he whispered. Saved all of us. The German shepherd beside him gave a soft whine at the name again. But after the blast started, Walter continued, his voice shaking, your grandfather got trapped under debris. The Marine swallowed hard. Walter looked directly at him for the first time. I pulled Daniel Reed out, he said quietly. But Ranger never made it back to the helicopter. Rex suddenly lowered his head beside Walter's hand. The old veteran's breathing broke for a second. I never forgave myself for leaving that dog behind. The Marine stared silently at his K9 partner. Because Rex had never acted this attached to a stranger before. Not once. Then the German shepherd slowly placed one paw against Walter's knee. And the old Navy SEAL finally began to cry. Walter tried to wipe the tears away quickly, embarrassed by them. But his hands shook too badly to hide anything anymore. Rex stayed beside him, unmoving. The Marine had seen this dog track suspects through gunfire and crawl into dangerous buildings without fear. Yet now the German shepherd stood perfectly still for one broken old man in a grocery store parking lot. Almost like this mission mattered more. Walter looked down at the dog and forced out a weak smile. Ranger used to sit exactly like that when he knew I was falling apart. The Marine felt something tighten in his chest. What happened after the mission? He asked softly. Walter stared toward the dark highway beyond the parking lot. I came home, he said, but part of me stayed there. He explained how the Navy SEAL team scattered after the operation. Some retired, some disappeared into quiet lives. Walter buried himself in work for years, trying not to think about the men they lost or the dog he could not save. Then his wife died. And the silence finally caught up with him. Rex slowly rested his head against Walter's leg again. Walter's fingers moved through the dog's fur without thinking now, like muscle memory returning after decades. The Marine noticed it too. You handled military dogs before Ranger, didn't you? Walter nodded faintly. Dogs see things people miss, he whispered. Fear, lies, pain. His eyes drifted down to Rex, and somehow this one saw me. The Marine looked at the unfinished letter still in his hand. You were going to send this to my family? Walter hesitated. I wanted your grandfather to know I never forgot him, he admitted. But I found out he passed away before I finished writing it. Silence settled between them again. Then Rex suddenly lifted his head and looked toward the grocery store entrance. 3 Marines in uniform were walking across the parking lot fast. The cashier had called someone. Walter's face immediately tightened with panic. No, he whispered. No ceremonies. No attention. He tried to step back toward his truck, but Rex moved gently in front of him, blocking the path without aggression. The German shepherd looked up at him calmly, almost asking him to stay. The Marine turned as the 3 uniformed Marines approached. The oldest one, a gray-haired gunnery sergeant, slowed when he saw Walter standing beside the truck with medals still clutched in his trembling hand. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the gunnery sergeant looked at the medals and quietly removed his cover. The other Marines did the same. Walter's breathing became uneven again. You don't have to do this, he muttered. Yes, the gunnery sergeant replied softly. We do. The parking lot fell silent except for distant traffic and the soft jingle of Rex's leash. The cashier stood near the store entrance crying openly now. A few customers nearby lowered their heads respectfully after realizing who the old man truly was. Walter looked overwhelmed by all of it. I was trying to sell them, he said bitterly, staring at the medals. Some hero. Rex immediately pressed against his side again. The Marine shook his head. A hero is still a hero when life gets hard. Walter looked away quickly, unable to hold eye contact anymore. The gunnery sergeant stepped closer carefully. Captain Reed told us what happened tonight. Walter's eyes moved toward the unfinished letter still sitting in the Marine's hand. That should have been mailed years ago, he whispered. The Marine folded the envelope carefully and placed it back into the wooden box. My grandfather would have wanted to meet you, he said quietly. And he would have thanked Ranger, too. At the sound of the old K9's name, Rex suddenly sat tall beside Walter like a soldier hearing a command. The gunnery sergeant noticed immediately. That dog's trying to tell us something, he murmured. Walter slowly nodded while staring at Rex. I think he already has. The Marines helped Walter sit on the lowered tailgate of his old pickup truck. His legs looked weak now, drained from emotions he had kept buried for decades. Rex stayed directly beside him, alert and protective. The gunnery sergeant carefully picked up one of the medals from the wooden box. His expression changed the moment he recognized it. Silver Star, he said quietly. Walter lowered his head. Doesn't feel worth much these days. The gunnery sergeant looked almost offended by the comment. That medal was earned in blood. Silence followed. Walter rubbed both hands together slowly, trying to steady them against the cold night air. I used to believe those medals meant something, he admitted. Then one day I couldn't even afford groceries. Rex suddenly nudged Walter's arm harder this time. Not comfort. Insistence. The German shepherd turned his attention toward the wooden box again and sniffed deeply near the bottom corner. The Marine frowned. What is it, boy? Rex pawed at the inside edge of the box. Walter looked confused. There's nothing else in there. But the dog kept scratching gently. Finally, the Marine reached underneath the stack of old letters and froze. There's a false bottom. Walter blinked in surprise. What? The Marine carefully lifted the thin wooden panel hidden beneath the envelopes. Under it sat a sealed plastic pouch wrapped tightly in old cloth. Walter stared at it like he had never seen it before. Rex whined softly. The Marine slowly opened the pouch. Inside was a military service photo of Ranger, and beneath it, a folded official document stamped with faded Navy markings. The gunnery sergeant carefully unfolded the paper. His eyes widened immediately. This isn't just paperwork, he whispered. Walter leaned forward weakly. What is it? The gunnery sergeant looked directly at him. It's the original recommendation for Ranger's military honor citation. Walter froze completely. The paper had never been submitted. Walter stared at the document in stunned silence. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Rex sat beside him quietly, eyes fixed on the old paper like he already understood its importance. The gunnery sergeant looked down at the faded pages again. This citation recommends Ranger for extraordinary bravery during combat operations, he said softly. It says the dog saved multiple lives before the explosion. Walter's hands began trembling harder. I thought that paperwork was lost, he whispered. The Marine carefully read another section and looked up slowly. Your name is on it too. Walter looked confused. For what? The Marine swallowed once before answering. For refusing evacuation while searching for Ranger after the blast. The old veteran shut his eyes immediately. Old pain crossed his face like a storm returning after years of silence. I couldn't leave him there, he whispered. Not after everything that dog did for us. Rex moved closer and rested his head gently against Walter's arm again. The gunnery sergeant kept reading. It says command denied the recommendation after the mission records became classified. Walter gave a bitter laugh. That sounds about right. The Marines exchanged quiet looks. One of them finally spoke. Sir, do you understand what this means? Walter shook his head slowly. The gunnery sergeant folded the document carefully. "It means Ranger was never forgotten, officially," he said. "The paperwork disappeared, but somebody tried to honor that dog." Rex suddenly lifted his ears and looked directly at Walter again. The old Navy SEAL stared back at him through watery eyes. For years he believed Ranger's story had died overseas in silence. But now, sitting in a grocery store parking lot beside a German Shepherd that refused to leave him alone, Walter realized something impossible. The dog had led them straight to the truth hidden beneath those letters. And for the first time in decades, Walter no longer felt completely invisible. The cold night air grew quieter around them. Cars still passed on the road beyond the parking lot, but none of the Marines moved. Nobody wanted to break the moment. Walter kept staring at the honor citation in the gunnery sergeant's hands. "I carried that box for 30 years, he said softly. "And I never knew that was hidden inside." Rex leaned against his leg again, calm now, like his job was finally making sense. The Marine looked down at his K9 partner. "You knew something was there the whole time, didn't you?" The German Shepherd gave a soft huff and stayed beside Walter. The cashier stepped closer carefully, holding a small grocery bag in both hands. "Sir," she said quietly, "please take the food." Walter looked embarrassed again. "I can't pay for it." "You already did," she whispered while glancing at the medals. Walter's eyes lowered. For most of the night, shame had controlled him, but standing beside Marines who now looked at him with respect instead of pity made something shift inside him. The gunnery sergeant carefully handed the Ranger citation back to Walter. "This belongs with you." Walter stared at the paper but did not take it immediately. "I failed that dog," he murmured. Rex immediately lifted his head and placed one paw gently against Walter's knee again. The Marine smiled faintly. "I don't think he agrees." Walter looked at Rex for a long moment. Then his voice cracked. "You know what the hardest part was?" Nobody answered. "Coming home alive, while the best partner I ever had didn't." Silence settled heavily across the parking lot. The Marines understood that kind of guilt. So did the German Shepherd sitting beside him. Finally, the gunnery sergeant spoke softly. "Then, maybe tonight isn't about medals." Walter looked up slowly. "Maybe it's about finally bringing Ranger home too." Rex's ears lifted instantly at the old dog's name, and Walter felt tears return to his eyes all over again. Walter looked down at the old citation paper in his shaking hands. The edges fluttered slightly in the cold wind. "Bring him home," he repeated quietly. Rex stayed pressed against his side, refusing to move even an inch away now. The Marine crouched beside Walter again. "My grandfather used to say military dogs never leave their teams behind," he said softly. "Maybe Ranger never left yours either." Walter's eyes filled instantly. For years he had carried memories that felt too heavy to speak aloud. But somehow, this German Shepherd had pulled every buried piece of pain into the open without a single word. The cashier gently placed the grocery bag beside Walter on the truck bed. "You shouldn't be alone tonight," she whispered. Walter stared at the food silently. Bread, eggs, milk. Simple things that once pushed him to sell the last pieces of his past. The gunnery sergeant suddenly straightened. "We're not done here," he said firmly. The Marines looked toward him. "That citation deserves recognition," he continued. "And so does he." Walter shook his head quickly. "No public attention." "This isn't attention," the gunnery sergeant replied. "This is honor." Rex lifted his ears again as if agreeing. The Marine pulled out his phone. "There's a retired military K9 foundation 2 counties over. They help preserve records like this." Walter looked stunned. "After all this time?" "They'll care," the Marine said. "Especially about Ranger." For several seconds, Walter could not speak. Then Rex suddenly stood and walked toward the passenger side of the truck again. He sniffed near the floorboard before looking back at Walter. The old veteran frowned slightly. "What now?" "The dog barked once." The Marine opened the truck door wider and reached underneath the seat again. His fingers touched something small hidden deep in the corner. When he pulled it out, Walter's face went pale. It was Ranger's old collar, covered in dust, still carrying the faded military tag attached to it. Walter grabbed the collar with both hands so fast the Marines almost startled. His fingers traced the cracked leather carefully, like he was afraid it might disappear again. "Oh my God," he whispered. Rex moved closer immediately and sniffed the old collar gently. Then he sat beside Walter in complete silence. The Marine looked stunned. "You kept it all these years?" Walter swallowed hard. "I thought I lost it after the funeral." "The funeral?" the cashier asked softly. Walter nodded without looking up from the collar. "We buried what little they recovered." His voice cracked badly now. Ranger was given military honors overseas. Small ceremony. Just a few of us. Rex lowered his head slowly against Walter's arm again. The old veteran finally broke completely. Tears rolled down his face as he clutched the worn collar against his chest. "I left him there," he whispered. "I promised that dog I'd come back for him, and I couldn't." The Marines stayed silent. No one tried to interrupt grief that old. The Marine beside Rex looked down at his K-9 partner thoughtfully. "My grandfather once said the SEAL who saved him trusted his dog more than anyone alive." Walter laughed weakly through tears. "That's because Ranger never lied to me." Rex suddenly stood and licked Walter's trembling hand once. The old man froze, then slowly smiled for the first time all night. Not a polite smile, a real one. Small, painful, human. The gunnery sergeant noticed it immediately. "There he is," he said quietly. Walter looked confused. "The man your team remembered." Silence settled over them again, softer now, not empty anymore. Healing. The Marine carefully looked at the old collar hanging from Walter's hands. "Sir, I think Rex found that for a reason." Walter glanced down at the German Shepherd. The dog stared back calmly, almost like he had been leading them toward this moment from the second he walked into the store. And deep inside, Walter started feeling something he had not felt in years. Maybe tonight was not the end of his story after all. The parking lot lights buzzed softly above them as Walter held Ranger's collar against his chest. The shaking in his hands had not stopped, but something inside him had changed. He no longer looked like a man trying to disappear. Rex sat beside him proudly, eyes calm, almost watchful. The Marine checked his phone, then looked back at Walter. "The K-9 Foundation answered already," he said. "They want to see the citation and Ranger's records tonight." Walter blinked in surprise. "Tonight?" "They said stories like this don't wait." The gunnery sergeant nodded firmly. "Neither should honor." Walter looked overwhelmed again. Too many emotions, too many memories opening at once. For years, nobody had asked about Ranger. Nobody had asked about him either. The cashier quietly handed Walter a warm coffee from inside the store. "You look freezing." Walter accepted it slowly. "Thank you." Rex rested his head against Walter's knee again, while the old veteran held the cup carefully between trembling hands. The Marine smiled faintly. "He's attached to you now." Walter looked down at the German Shepherd. "I think I'm attached to him too." That earned the first small laugh of the night from the Marines. But the moment softened quickly when Walter opened the folded citation again. Near the bottom sat a faded signature he had not noticed before. His face suddenly tightened. "What is it?" the Marine asked. Walter pointed toward the signature line with unsteady fingers. "That officer," he whispered. "He died 6 months after writing this." The gunnery sergeant leaned closer. The name carried weight. "Respect. That means he fought to protect Ranger's honor before he passed," he said quietly. Walter stared silently at the paper. For decades he believed the mission ended in loss, guilt, and silence. But piece by piece, Rex had uncovered something else hidden beneath all that pain. People had remembered. People had tried. And now the old Navy SEAL finally realized the truth that hurt the most. He had spent years punishing himself for a story that was never forgotten. Walter lowered the citation slowly and stared out across the dark parking lot. His eyes looked distant again, but not lost this time. Rex stayed close beside him, leaning gently against his leg, like he understood every thought moving through the old veteran's mind. The Marine slipped his phone back into his pocket. "The Foundation director is driving in personally," he said. "She wants to meet you." Walter shook his head faintly. "I'm just an old man who almost traded medals for groceries." The gunnery sergeant stepped forward immediately. "No," he said firmly, "you're the man who carried a fallen K-9's memory for 30 years. Silence followed. Walter looked down at Ranger's collar in his hands. The faded leather felt heavier now, filled with years he could never get back. Rex suddenly lifted his head and stared toward the highway entrance beside the store. A black SUV was pulling slowly into the parking lot. The Marine glanced over. That should be her. The vehicle stopped nearby, and a woman in a dark jacket stepped out holding a folder against her chest. The moment she saw Walter holding the old military collar, her expression changed completely. She walked toward him carefully. "Walter Hayes?" she asked softly. Walter nodded once. The woman looked down at Rex first, then at the old citation papers. "I've been searching for these records for almost 10 years, she admitted. Walter looked stunned. "Why?" She opened the folder slowly. Inside were old military photographs of Ranger during training exercises overseas. "There are stories about that dog all through retired K-9 circles," she explained. Most people believed the official citation was destroyed. Walter's eyes widened slightly as he looked through the photos. Rex quietly moved closer again, sniffing the pictures one by one. The woman smiled faintly at the German Shepherd. He knew there was unfinished history here before any of us did. Walter stared down at Rex in disbelief. The dog looked back calmly, not proud, not excited, just certain. And for the first time in decades, Walter no longer felt like a forgotten soldier standing alone in the dark. The woman introduced herself as Claire Bennett, director of the retired military K-9 Foundation. She knelt carefully beside Rex first, letting the German Shepherd sniff her hand before speaking again. "He's a beautiful dog," she whispered. The Marine smiled slightly. "Best partner I've ever had." Claire's eyes moved back to Walter, and Ranger may have been one of the most important military dogs we ever lost. Walter looked stunned by the words. For years, Ranger had only existed in his memories. Quiet, buried, forgotten. But now strangers were speaking the dog's name with respect. Claire opened another folder inside her case. "We recovered partial records from old classified operations last year," she explained. "Your mission kept appearing in pieces." Walter's breathing slowed. "You knew about the mission?" "Only fragments," Claire said. "A Navy SEAL team. A military K-9. Lives saved during a failed operation." Rex stayed seated beside Walter, completely calm now, like he had finally guided everyone to the right place. Claire carefully removed one final photograph from the folder. Walter froze the second he saw it. It showed Ranger standing beside Walter near the helicopter before deployment. Someone had written words across the bottom in faded ink. "The dog who wouldn't leave his team behind." Walter's eyes instantly filled again. The Marine quietly looked away, giving him a moment. Claire's voice softened. That phrase stayed attached to Ranger's records all these years. Walter shook his head slowly in disbelief. "I thought nobody remembered." "We remembered the dog," Claire said gently. "We just never knew the full story behind him." Rex suddenly rested his head against Walter's arm again. The old veteran smiled weakly through tears and scratched behind the German Shepherd's ears. "You really weren't going to leave me alone tonight, were you?" Rex's tail gave one slow wag. The Marines nearby smiled quietly. But Claire's expression suddenly became serious again as she looked back at the citation papers. "There's something else you need to know," she said carefully. Walter's smile faded. Claire looked directly at him. "The military recently reopened several classified commendation reviews connected to your mission." The parking lot went silent again. Because Walter suddenly realized this story was not finished yet. Walter stared at Claire without blinking. The words barely felt real. "Reopened?" he whispered. Claire nodded slowly. 3 months ago. New records surfaced during an archive review. Rex immediately lifted his ears beside Walter, sensing the shift in tension. The Marine stepped closer. "What kind of review?" Claire carefully looked at the old citation papers in Walter's hands. "The military believes several honors connected to that mission were never properly completed," she explained. "Including Rangers." Walter's grip tightened around the collar. For 30 years, he had lived believing everything connected to that night was buried forever. But now, old truths were climbing back into the light, one piece at a time. The gunnery sergeant crossed his arms tightly. "You're saying the military may finally recognize the dog officially?" Claire nodded again, and possibly the SEAL who stayed behind searching for him. Walter immediately shook his head. No attention for me." Rex pressed against his side harder the moment he spoke. The Marine noticed it instantly. "He does that every time you try to push yourself aside." Walter looked down at the dog. The German Shepherd stared back firmly, almost stubbornly. Claire opened her folder again and removed one final paper. Unlike the others, this document looked new. Fresh signatures, fresh dates. "At the moment," she said softly, "you're listed as missing testimony." Walter looked confused. "Testimony for what?" Claire hesitated briefly. Then she handed him the paper. Walter's eyes moved slowly across the page. Suddenly, his breathing stopped. At the very top sat Ranger's full military identification number, and beneath it, recommendation for posthumous national military honor. Walter's hands began shaking violently. The Marines fell silent around him. Rex slowly rested his head against Walter's knee again, grounding him before he collapsed under the weight of the moment. Walter looked at Claire, with tears already forming. They still want to honor him, after all this time? Claire's voice cracked softly. "Sir, some dogs change history." Walter looked down at Ranger's collar in one hand and Rex beside him in the other. Then the old Navy SEAL finally understood something that hit harder than any medal ever could. Ranger had not been forgotten. And neither had he. Walter lowered his head as tears rolled quietly onto Ranger's old collar. For years he had carried guilt like a punishment. Now, standing in a grocery store parking lot surrounded by Marines and a German Shepherd that refused to leave him, that weight finally began to crack. Rex stayed pressed against his leg, calm and steady. The Marine placed a hand gently on Walter's shoulder. "My grandfather used to say, some heroes disappear because they think surviving was the easy part." Walter let out a weak breath. He was right. Claire carefully closed the folder in her hands. "The military board meets in 2 weeks," she explained. "But before anything happens, they need your account of that mission." Walter looked uneasy immediately. "I haven't talked about that night in decades." Rex lifted his head at once and nudged Walter's hand again. The Marine smiled faintly. "Looks like your partner disagrees." Walter stared at the dog for several seconds. Then slowly, painfully, he nodded. "Maybe it's time." The Marines nearby relaxed slightly, almost relieved to hear it. Claire reached into her coat pocket and handed Walter a small business card. "We can help with everything," she said. "Housing assistance, veteran support, medical care too." Walter looked embarrassed again. "I'm not looking for charity." "That's not charity," the gunnery sergeant replied firmly. "That's respect." Rex's tail moved once against the pavement. Walter looked around the parking lot slowly. Just 1 hour earlier, he had stood inside that grocery store ready to trade away pieces of his life for food. Now people were speaking Ranger's name with honor. People were speaking his name too. The cashier stepped closer carefully. "Sir, your groceries are still in the truck." Walter looked at the bag and gave a tired laugh through his tears. "Funny," he murmured. "I walked in there thinking I had nothing left." Rex rested his head gently against Walter's knee again, and for the first time in years, the old Navy SEAL realized he might finally have something worth holding on to again. The Marines helped Walter into the passenger seat of his old pickup while Rex climbed into the back beside the wooden box of letters. The German Shepherd refused to let the box out of his sight now. Walter looked over his shoulder at the dog and shook his head softly. "You really did drag my whole past back into the light tonight." Rex answered with one quiet huff. The Marine slid behind the wheel. "We're taking you somewhere warm first," he said. "Then tomorrow we start figuring everything else out." Walter glanced down at the grocery bag resting near his boots. Bread. Milk. Eggs. Simple things. But somehow they no longer felt like symbols of shame. Claire followed behind them in her SUV, while the other Marines pulled out slowly from the parking lot. Nobody rushed. The night felt too important for that. As they drove through the quiet streets, Walter kept holding Ranger's collar in both hands. The Marine glanced toward him carefully. "You okay?" Walter stared out the window for several seconds before answering. "I spent 30 years believing I failed everyone," he admitted. "My team." "Ranger. Your grandfather." Rex moved closer in the back seat until his head rested gently against Walter's shoulder from behind. The old veteran closed his eyes for a moment. "But tonight," he whispered, "this dog keeps making me feel like maybe Ranger never blamed me at all." The Marine tightened his hands slightly on the steering wheel. "My grandfather didn't blame you either," he said quietly. "He called you the bravest man he ever met." Walter looked down immediately, overwhelmed again. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the truck windows. The city lights blurred across the glass while silence settled warmly inside the cab. Not empty silence. Peaceful silence. Rex stayed against Walter the entire drive, like he understood the old man still needed someone beside him. And deep down, Walter realized something strange. The pain was still there. The memories were still there. But for the first time in decades, he was no longer carrying them alone. The truck finally pulled into the parking lot of a small veteran center on the edge of town. Warm yellow lights glowed through the windows while rain continued falling softly outside. Walter stared at the building quietly. "I haven't been to a place like this since my wife passed," he admitted. The Marine turned off the engine. "Then tonight's a good night to come back." Rex jumped down first the moment the door opened. Instead of running ahead, the German Shepherd stayed beside Walter carefully while the old Navy SEAL stepped out into the cold rain. Claire and the other Marines followed close behind carrying the wooden box and grocery bags. The moment Walter entered the building, several older veterans sitting near the lobby looked up. Most barely noticed the Marines. But all of them noticed Rex. The German Shepherd walked beside Walter like a trained escort, calm and proud. One elderly veteran slowly stood from his chair. His eyes locked onto the collar hanging from Walter's hand. "That a military K9 collar?" he asked quietly. Walter nodded once. The room became silent. Another veteran lowered his coffee cup slowly. "Whose dog?" Walter looked down at the faded tag. His name was Ranger. Something changed in the room instantly. The men sitting there understood. Not just the dog. The loss behind the name. Rex pressed gently against Walter's leg again, as if reminding him he was not standing there alone anymore. Claire stepped forward carefully. This man served beside Ranger during a classified overseas operation years ago. One of the older veterans stared at Walter in disbelief. You're Walter Hayes? Walter froze. The man slowly shook his head. I heard stories about that mission 30 years ago. Walter looked overwhelmed again. Stories? The veteran nodded. About a SEAL and a military dog who saved an entire extraction team. Rex lifted his ears proudly beside him. Walter looked down at the floor, fighting emotion. For decades he believed history forgot him. But now, one stranger after another kept proving something impossible. People had remembered all along. One of the older veterans slowly walked closer to Walter, his cane tapping softly against the floor. His eyes stayed fixed on Ranger's collar. I served with Marines who talked about that operation for years, he said quietly. Most thought the stories were exaggerated. Walter gave a weak smile. I wish they were. Rex remained beside him, calm but alert, watching every movement in the room. The veteran looked down at the German Shepherd. That dog brought you here for a reason. Walter glanced at Rex and nodded faintly. I'm starting to believe that too. Claire helped place the wooden box carefully onto a nearby table while the Marines unloaded the groceries and supplies. Nobody treated Walter like a charity case. Every movement carried quiet respect. The Marine handed Walter a warm towel from the front desk. You should sit down. Walter lowered himself slowly into a chair near the fireplace. Rex immediately laid beside him, resting one paw across Walter's boot. The old Navy SEAL looked down at the dog with tired eyes. You don't let people drift too far, do you? Rex blinked slowly. An older man sitting near the fire suddenly leaned forward. You know, he said softly, there's a wall upstairs with photos of military K-9 teams. Claire looked toward Walter carefully. We added Ranger's name years ago, she admitted. But we never had a photo. Walter stared at her in surprise. You honored him without proof? Claire nodded. Some stories become bigger than paperwork. Silence filled the room again. Then, the Marine carefully removed the photograph from the wooden box, the one showing Walter, Daniel Reed, and Ranger standing together before the mission. Claire's eyes widened instantly. That's the missing photo, she whispered. Walter looked down at it quietly. For years, he had kept that picture hidden beneath old letters and guilt. Now, everyone around him stared at it like it belonged to history itself. Rex slowly stood and nudged the photo once with his nose. The room fell silent again. Because somehow, without speaking a single word, the German Shepherd had reunited a forgotten team after 30 long years. Claire carefully picked up the photograph with both hands, almost afraid to damage it. The firelight reflected softly across the faded image of Walter, Daniel Reed, and Ranger standing shoulder to shoulder before deployment. This belongs on the wall upstairs, she whispered. Walter stared at the floor for a long moment. I don't know if I belong on any wall. The Marine immediately shook his head. That's the problem, sir. You spent too many years believing that. Rex lifted his head and rested his chin gently on Walter's knee again. The older veterans around the room stayed quiet, listening. One man near the fireplace finally spoke. You know what happens to soldiers who carry guilt too long? Walter glanced toward him. They start hiding from the people who would have understood them. That hit harder than Walter expected. His fingers tightened around Ranger's collar while old memories pushed through his mind again. Explosions, smoke, screaming over radios, Ranger barking through the chaos. Then silence. Rex suddenly sat upright beside him. The Marine noticed it first. What is it, buddy? The German Shepherd stared toward the staircase at the end of the hall. Claire followed his gaze slowly. The memorial wall is upstairs. Without hesitation, Rex stood and started walking toward it. Walter watched him go. The dog stopped halfway up the stairs and looked back. Waiting. The room grew quiet again. The Marine smiled softly. Looks like he wants you to see something. Walter hesitated. For years he had avoided places filled with military memories, avoided ceremonies, avoided names, avoided photographs. But Rex kept waiting at the top of the stairs like this was another mission he refused to abandon. Finally, Walter pushed himself slowly out of the chair. His knees shook badly as he climbed the stairs one step at a time. Rex stayed beside him the entire way. At the top-floor hallway, dozens of framed military canine photographs covered the walls. Handlers, dogs, teams that served together. Walter moved slowly through them until he suddenly stopped cold. At the center of the memorial wall sat a small brass nameplate. Ranger. Below it were engraved words Walter had never seen before. Loyal until his final breath. Walter's legs almost gave out beneath him. Rex immediately pressed against his side to hold him steady, and for the first time since that terrible mission 30 years ago, Walter finally saluted his dog again. Walter's trembling hand stayed raised in salute long after the room fell silent behind him. The old Navy SEAL could barely breathe. Rain tapped softly against the upstairs windows while the memorial wall glowed under warm lights. Photographs of military K-9 teams surrounded him on every side, but Walter could only see one name: Ranger. Rex stood pressed firmly against his leg, holding him upright when his strength almost disappeared completely. Behind them, the Marines and veterans slowly gathered at the top of the stairs. Nobody interrupted the moment. Nobody needed to. Walter lowered his hand carefully and touched the brass nameplate with his fingertips. "I should have come back sooner," he whispered. The Marine stepped beside him quietly. "You came back when you were ready." Walter shook his head weakly. "No," he murmured while looking down at Rex. "He brought me back." Rex's ears lifted at the sound of Walter's voice. Claire carefully placed the recovered photograph beneath Ranger's memorial spot for everyone to see. Several older veterans stared at it in silence. One man wiped his eyes openly. Another slowly saluted the wall. Walter looked overwhelmed all over again. For decades, he believed Ranger disappeared into forgotten history overseas. Yet here, inside a quiet veteran center, strangers had honored the dog year after year without ever knowing the full story. The Marine noticed Walter struggling emotionally and gently placed Daniel Reed's dog tag into his hand. "My grandfather carried your name in his heart until the day he died," he said softly. "You weren't abandoned, sir. You were just lost for a while." Walter stared down at the dog tag silently. Rex rested his head against Walter's arm again. The old veteran closed his eyes tightly as emotion finally broke through every wall he had spent 30 years building around himself. And standing beneath Ranger's memorial, surrounded by people who still remembered, Walter Hayes finally stopped feeling like a ghost. Walter stood silently before the memorial wall while tears rolled freely down his weathered face. For once, he did not try to hide them. Rex stayed close beside him, calm and steady, like he understood the hardest part of the mission was finally over. The older veterans downstairs slowly began climbing the stairs one by one. Some walked with canes, some moved slowly from old injuries. But every single man stopped in front of Ranger's nameplate with respect. One retired Marine saluted the wall quietly. Another reached down to pet Rex before whispering, "Good dog." Walter watched all of it in disbelief. 30 years of silence had convinced him nobody cared anymore. Yet now, complete strangers were honoring a dog they had never even met. Claire stepped beside him carefully. "Tomorrow morning," she said softly, "the military board wants to speak with you directly." Walter looked nervous immediately. "What if I can't do it?" Rex gently nudged Walter's hand again. The Marine smiled faintly. "Then your partner will help you." That earned a small laugh from several veterans nearby. Walter looked down at Rex and slowly shook his head. "You really don't quit, do you?" Rex's tail moved once against the floor. The room relaxed slightly after that. Coffee was brought upstairs. Chairs were moved near the memorial wall. Veterans began quietly sharing old stories about military dogs they had served beside over the years. For the first time in decades, Walter listened instead of hiding from those conversations. Then, one older veteran near the back of the room spoke up. "I knew Daniel Reed." Walter turned immediately. The man nodded slowly. "Your Marine friend's grandfather." Walter's chest tightened. "He talked about you constantly after that mission," the veteran continued. "Said a Navy SEAL and his K-9 saved his life when everybody else thought he was dead." Walter looked overwhelmed again. The old veteran smiled softly. "He spent years trying to find you." Rex leaned gently against Walter's leg once more as silence settled across the memorial hall. And deep inside, Walter finally realized something that changed everything. He had never truly been forgotten. He had only been waiting for someone brave enough to find him again. Walter slowly sat down beneath Ranger's memorial wall while the conversations around him continued softly. Veterans spoke about old deployments, loyal dogs, and teammates they still missed after decades. But Walter barely heard any of it. His eyes stayed fixed on the photograph Claire had placed beneath Ranger's name. Younger faces. Younger lives. A version of himself that still believed everyone would make it home. Rex laid quietly at his feet, but every few seconds the German Shepherd glanced up at him, checking him the way loyal dogs always do. The Marine sat beside Walter holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one over carefully. "You're shaking less now," he said. Walter looked down at his hands. He was right. For the first time in years, the constant trembling had eased slightly. "Funny," Walter murmured. "I thought tonight would end with me sleeping in that truck again." The Marine looked toward Rex. Guess he had different plans. Rex's ears lifted immediately at the sound of their voices. Several veterans nearby smiled quietly. Then Claire's phone suddenly vibrated in her hand. The room grew still when she answered. "Yes, sir," she said respectfully. "He's here." Walter looked up slowly. Claire listened for another few seconds before lowering the phone. The military review board moved the meeting forward, she explained carefully. "They want to see you first thing in the morning." Walter's stomach tightened instantly. "I don't belong in front of a board." The gunnery sergeant answered before anyone else could. "You belonged there 30 years ago." Silence followed. Walter looked down again, struggling with the weight of everything happening around him. Rex suddenly stood and placed both front paws gently against Walter's knees. The old veteran blinked in surprise. The German Shepherd held eye contact firmly, almost demanding Walter stay present instead of retreating into fear again. The Marine laughed softly under his breath. That's his working mode. Walter slowly placed one hand on Rex's neck. "You really think I can do this?" Rex gave one soft bark. The room smiled, and for the first time since walking into that grocery store, ready to trade away his medals for food, Walter Hayes finally started believing tomorrow might still matter. Morning light slowly filled the Veteran Center through the tall windows upstairs. Most of the building was still quiet, but Walter had not slept at all. He sat alone beneath Ranger's memorial wall with the old collar resting in his lap. Rex never left his side once during the night. The German Shepherd laid beside Walter's chair, eyes half closed but always alert whenever the old veteran shifted or sighed too heavily. Walter rubbed one tired hand across his face. "I used to brief missions with less stress than this," he muttered softly. The Marine walked upstairs carrying fresh coffee. "That's because this one matters more." Walter accepted the cup slowly. Downstairs, vehicles began arriving outside the center. Military officials. Veterans. Representatives from the K-9 Foundation. The review board had come in person. Walter immediately looked uneasy again. Rex lifted his head at once and nudged Walter's hand before anxiety could fully take hold. The Marine noticed it. Every time you start pulling away, he brings you back. Walter looked down at the dog quietly. Ranger used to do that too. Claire appeared at the top of the stairs holding several folders against her chest. They're ready whenever you are. Walter stared toward the hallway in silence. 30 years ago, he walked away from this story believing it would disappear forever. Now, people were waiting downstairs to hear the truth he spent half his life hiding from. His breathing became uneven again. Then Rex stood up, without command, without hesitation. The German Shepherd walked directly toward the staircase and stopped halfway down before looking back at Walter, waiting again. The Marine smiled faintly. Looks like your partner is leading this operation too. Several veterans nearby chuckled softly. Walter looked at Rex for a long moment. Then, slowly, with trembling legs and tired eyes, the old Navy SEAL stood up beside Ranger's memorial wall one final time. He clipped Ranger's old collar carefully onto his belt loop. And with Rex walking beside him, Walter Hayes finally went downstairs to face the story he had been running from for 30 years. The conference room downstairs fell completely silent the moment Walter entered beside Rex. Several military officers stood near the far table reviewing documents and old mission records. A few wore dress uniforms covered in ribbons. Others looked older, retired, but still carried the posture of command. Yet every pair of eyes shifted immediately toward the German Shepherd walking calmly beside the old Navy SEAL. Walter almost stopped at the doorway. Rex immediately pressed against his leg again, grounding him. The Marine placed a steady hand on Walter's shoulder. "You're not alone in here." Walter nodded faintly and stepped forward. Claire carefully placed the recovered citation papers and Ranger's collar onto the center table. The room watched silently. One gray-haired officer slowly stood. "Walter Hayes," he said respectfully. "We've been trying to reconstruct that mission for years." Walter looked uncomfortable under the attention. "I'm not sure how much help I'll be." The officer glanced toward Rex briefly before answering. "Your dog already helped more than you realize." That hit Walter harder than expected. Rex quietly sat beside his chair as Walter lowered himself into the seat. The German Shepherd never looked away from him for a second. The officer opened a folder filled with classified reports. For decades, he explained, the mission records remained incomplete after several files were lost during overseas transfers. Walter gave a tired laugh. "Sounds familiar." A few people in the room smiled softly. Then the officer slid a photograph across the table. Walter's breath caught instantly. It showed Ranger during the final operation, alive, alert, standing beside Walter seconds before deployment. "We found this image 6 months ago," the officer said quietly. That's when we realized the military K-9 citation had never been finalized. Walter stared at the picture with trembling hands. Rex slowly rested his head against Walter's knee again. The officer's expression softened. "Sir, your dog's actions that night saved 11 lives." Walter shut his eyes tightly. For 30 years, guilt had drowned out everything else. But hearing the number spoken aloud changed something inside him. 11 lives. Rex stayed beside him silently, while the old Navy SEAL finally allowed himself to hear the truth. Ranger had not died forgotten. He had died a hero. The room stayed silent while Walter stared at the photograph in front of him. His weathered fingers shook against the edge of the table. 11 lives. For decades, all he remembered was the one life he could not save. Rex stayed close beside him, head resting firmly against Walter's knee like he knew the old veteran was barely holding himself together. One of the officers gently opened another file. "There's more," he said quietly. Walter looked up slowly. The officer slid several papers across the table: official statements, witness reports, old mission transcripts. Every one of them mentioned Ranger. And every one mentioned Walter refusing evacuation while searching through burning debris for the wounded military dog. Walter stared at the pages in disbelief. I thought command buried all this. They buried the mission, the officer corrected softly. Not the bravery. The Marine beside Walter smiled faintly at that. Claire carefully unfolded the original recommendation citation again. After reviewing the recovered records, she said, "The board has reached a unanimous decision." Walter's chest tightened immediately. The gray-haired officer stood slowly from his chair. Ranger will officially receive full posthumous military honors for valor. The room fell completely still. Walter lowered his head as emotion crashed through him all at once. Rex immediately pushed closer against his leg. And, the officer continued, Walter Hayes will receive formal recognition for extraordinary courage during the operation. Walter shook his head quickly. No, this should be about the dog. The officer smiled gently. That's exactly what every report says you would say. Several people in the room laughed softly through emotion. Walter looked down at Ranger's collar hanging from his belt loop. For years he believed the mission ended only in pain. But now the truth stood in front of him. Ranger's loyalty had survived 30 years. Daniel Reed's family never stopped searching. Veterans still remembered the story, and one stubborn German shepherd named Rex had somehow pulled all of it back into the light. The officer stepped closer, holding a small velvet case in his hands. Inside rested a newly engraved military honor medal. For Ranger. Walter's breathing broke completely as he looked at it. Rex stayed beside him through every second of it, just like Ranger once had. Walter stared at the medal inside the velvet case while tears blurred his vision completely. The silver caught the morning light from the conference room windows, shining brighter than anything he had seen in years. For a moment, nobody spoke. Rex slowly rested his head across Walter's lap again, calm and steady beneath the storm of emotion breaking inside the old veteran. The gray-haired officer carefully lifted the medal from the case. "Walter Hayes," he said quietly, "on behalf of the United States military, we recognize the courage, loyalty, and sacrifice shown by military K-9 Ranger during Operation Black Tide." Walter closed his eyes tightly at the operation name. He had not heard those words spoken aloud in 30 years. The officer continued, "And we recognize the Navy SEAL who refused to leave his partner behind." Walter lowered his head immediately. The officer stepped around the table and gently placed the medal into Walter's trembling hands. The old Navy SEAL looked completely overwhelmed now. "I couldn't save him," he whispered weakly. The room stayed silent for a second. Then, Claire spoke softly from across the table. "You carried him home anyway." Walter looked down at Ranger's collar hanging beside the medal. Rex shifted closer against him, almost like he was holding the old man together piece by piece. The Marine beside Walter wiped his eyes quickly before speaking. "My grandfather used to say loyalty is measured by who stays when things fall apart." Walter's breathing shook. Ranger stayed, the Marine continued. "And so did you." Several officers nodded quietly around the room. For decades, Walter believed surviving the mission made him weak, but hearing the truth from others finally forced him to see what Ranger had always known. He never abandoned his team. He never abandoned the dog. He simply carried too much pain alone for too long. Rex suddenly lifted his head and gave one soft bark that echoed lightly through the room. The tension broke instantly. Small smiles appeared around the table. Walter looked down at the German shepherd beside him and laughed weakly through tears. "Yeah," he whispered while scratching behind Rex's ears. "Guess you finally completed your mission too." And for the first time since that terrible night overseas, Walter Hayes no longer felt ashamed to wear his medals again. The ceremony took place 3 days later beneath a gray morning sky outside the Veterans Center. Marines stood in formal lines beside retired service members, military handlers, and families carrying small American flags. At the center of it all stood Walter Hayes beside Rex. The old Navy SEAL wore his cleaned dress coat for the first time in decades. His medals rested proudly across his chest again instead of lying forgotten on a grocery store counter. Rex sat calmly beside him, wearing a ceremonial K9 service vest prepared by the Foundation. Walter looked down at the German Shepherd and shook his head softly. "You really changed everything, didn't you?" Rex's tail moved once against the pavement. Claire stepped onto the small stage near Ranger's memorial display. Behind her stood the framed photograph of Walter, Daniel Reed, and Ranger before the mission. The same photo hidden for 30 years inside that wooden box. Claire looked toward the crowd. Today, she began, "We honor a military dog whose loyalty survived long after history tried to bury his story." Silence spread across the ceremony grounds. Walter tightened his grip on Ranger's old collar hanging from his hand. Claire continued. Ranger saved 11 lives during Operation Black Tide and remained loyal until his final breath. Several veterans lowered their heads quietly. The Marine stepped beside Walter, holding the newly engraved military medal. "My grandfather spent the rest of his life searching for the man and dog who saved him," he said. "Today, they finally come home together." Walter's eyes filled immediately. Rex leaned gently against his leg again, as if sensing the emotion rising too fast. The Marine carefully handed Walter the medal. "For Ranger." Walter looked down at it silently before attaching it beside Ranger's old collar display. The crowd began applauding softly, not loud, not dramatic, respectful, real. Walter looked out at the faces surrounding him, Marines, veterans, strangers, families. And then, at Rex. Only days earlier, he had walked into a grocery store ready to trade away his medals for food. Now, he stood surrounded by people who refused to let him disappear. Rex looked up at him calmly, the same look Ranger used to give him years ago. And deep inside, Walter finally understood something that healed the part of him broken for decades. Loyal dogs never truly leave their teams behind.